Montgomery, Alabama. A place where time moved a little slower and the Bible still sat on kitchen tables next to sweet tea and family photographs. On South Madison Street, the Second Grace Baptist Church stood like a monument to tradition. Red brick, white steeple, and a hand-painted sign that read, "God is love. Come as you are." That Sunday morning in March started like any other. The choir warmed up in the back, humming low harmonies. The ushers straightened bulletins and polished their shoes with spit. The parking lot filled with Cadillacs and Chevys as deacons in three-piece suits greeted smiling congregants. Women in wide-brimmed hats hugged one another. Children ran under pews before being hushed by their mothers. It was church the way generations had known it. And then there was Pastor Elijah Franklin, 70 years old and still commanding the pulpit like a man half his age. His white beard trimmed neatly, voice as rich as molasses and just as slow. He wasn't just their preacher. He was their compass, their counselor, their community's moral anchor. For over 3 decades, Elijah preached forgiveness, family, and truth. He buried the town's fathers and baptized their children. He prayed with the sick and sat with the dying. And always by his side, like the quiet shadow of grace, stood his wife Rebecca, poised, elegant, kind-eyed. The congregation called them God's couple. No children of their own, but 12 foster kids raised in love in a home that never turned away a soul in need. At 10:02 a.m., Elijah walked into the sanctuary with a calm smile and a leather-bound Bible tucked beneath his arm. But those who watched closely might have noticed his step was slower. His eyes clouded. Something off. By 10:23 a.m., the service was halfway through. The choir's final note faded into silence. Elijah rose from his seat and stepped behind the podium. He didn't open the Bible. He didn't look at the crowd. For a long moment, he just stood there, hands trembling slightly. And then he spoke. "I have something to confess. Not for forgiveness, but for truth. This house of God has been built on honesty. But I have lived a lie." Gasps echoed through the pews. A woman dropped her hymn book. Somewhere in the back, a baby cried. No one could imagine how the next 10 minutes would change everything. Not just for Elijah, but for everyone who had ever believed in him. Before the sermon turned to blood and headlines, before the whispered words, hate crime, or betrayal ever hung in the Alabama air, there was just love. Elijah Franklin had fallen for Rebecca in the summer of 1990, beneath a white canopy at a community fundraiser for the Montgomery Youth Shelter. He was 35 then, already a veteran, a young pastor trying to make something holy out of a storefront church and a broken past. She wore a lavender dress and passed out lemonade with a shy smile. Her voice was soft but steady. Her kindness cut through noise. "You don't talk much," Elijah had said, approaching with his usual quiet charm. "I say what matters," she'd answered, not looking up. "And what matters right now?" "That you're blocking the fan," she said, and finally smiled. That was all it took. They were married by fall. No long courtship, no scandal. Just 2 adults, already shaped by life, choosing each other the way some folks choose faith. Not because it's easy, but because it saves you. And save Elijah, she did. Rebecca became the spine of the church behind the scenes. She never tried to steal the spotlight. She baked pies for fundraisers, led prayer calls for the sick, held grieving mothers through miscarriages and funerals. She spoke little, but when she did, people leaned in. Some said she had the calming presence of an angel. Others joked God had put her on earth to soften Elijah's sharper edges. The Franklins were never blessed with biological children, a fact they never explained and no one dared ask about. Instead, they poured their love into others. Over 3 decades, they fostered 12 children, boys and girls from broken homes, prisons, abuse. Kids who couldn't sleep through the night unless Elijah knelt beside their beds and whispered Psalm 91. Kids who found their first taste of stability in Rebecca's warm cornbread and secondhand lullabies. The town adored them. They were the heartbeat of the community, the kind of couple that made people believe in goodness again. Their picture hung in City Hall under a banner that read "Faith in Action." In 2008, the mayor awarded them the Montgomery Service Medal. Church folks called them a blessing. Outsiders called them lucky. But what they didn't know, what no one could have known, was that Elijah's love for Rebekah wasn't just deep. It was anchoring. She wasn't just his wife. She was his proof that God still made beauty from brokenness. After the war, after the nightmares, after the long nights of shaking hands and whiskey-breathed doubt, Rebekah was the one who held him together. "You gave me back my name," he once told her. "I came home half a man, and you made me whole again." So when the phone call came from a stranger in a hospital gown holding a clipboard, it didn't just shake him. It cracked the very stone of his soul. That morning, Elijah had just finished his daily devotional when the hospital rang. A routine call, meant for a patient. Something about test results. A name. A medical note. "Are you Mr. Franklin?" the woman asked. "Speaking. This is regarding Rebekah Franklin's recent scan. We found, well, the absence of a uterus isn't necessarily dangerous, but we may want to explore further." Elijah froze. "Excuse me. I'm sorry," she said quickly. "This is regarding her pelvic imaging. You're listed as her emergency contact. We've scheduled a follow-up, but just so you know." He hung up before she could finish. No uterus? What did that even mean? It could be nothing. A medical anomaly. A mistake in the record. But something in Elijah's chest twisted. That old military instinct, the one that taught him to sniff out lies, read between silences, kicked in. Rebekah had never once seen a gynecologist in their marriage. Never mentioned cramps. Never joked about menopause. She'd always found ways to quietly excuse herself from the conversation. And now, like a hairline crack in a stained glass window, everything began to fracture. In the days that followed, Elijah didn't question her. He didn't pray for clarity. He searched. What he found would shatter 30 years of love and turn Montgomery's most beloved man of God into something the town had never seen coming. It started with a file cabinet in the attic. Elijah waited until Rebekah left the house for her weekly Bible study circle, something she'd been leading for nearly 20 years. It gave him exactly 90 minutes. That morning, he climbed the narrow staircase above the guest room, where they stored records, old tax returns, family photos, and decades of paperwork in labeled boxes and metal drawers. The attic smelled of cedar and dust. The light was dim, save for a slant of sun cutting through the vented window. He opened the drawers with steady hands, but his heart was not so calm. Thump, thump, thump. His pulse roared louder than the creak of the floorboards. "Maybe it's nothing," he whispered to himself. "Maybe I'm a fool." But somewhere in the back of that metal drawer, behind marriage licenses, property deeds, and immunization records, Elijah found a small manila envelope. It wasn't labeled. No handwriting on the outside, but it was thick, sealed, and too carefully tucked between folders to be accidental. His fingers hesitated, then tore it open. Out slid a single document. State of Georgia Certificate of Live Birth. Name, Reginald Allen Parks. Sex, male. Date of birth, April 17th, 1961. Parents, Wilma and Leonard Parks. Elijah read it once, then again, then a third time. Reginald Allen Parks. He dropped the certificate onto the dusty floor, his chest tightening. Underneath, it was a name change affidavit. Stamped. Legal. Reginald Allen Parks, now legally recognized as Rebekah Grace Franklin. His hands began to shake. This wasn't a lie told in passing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an entire life. An identity. A truth buried so deep he never even thought to question it. Elijah stumbled backward, gripping a storage shelf for balance. The attic spun. The air felt thick and dry, like something holy had been sucked out of the room. For 30 years, he'd called her blessing, beloved wife. For 30 years, he'd thanked God for bringing her into his life. But now, who was I loving? He whispered aloud. He didn't take the file with him. He didn't burn it. He simply left it there, sitting open on the floor like a scar that refused to heal. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the guest room bed, Bible closed beside him, staring at the wall until the sun rose. Rebekah came home from church late. Her keys jingled, her voice humming a soft hymn. He didn't speak a word to her. For 3 days, he said nothing. He went through the motions, shaving, dressing, nodding at the mailman. But his spirit had gone quiet. A man once full of scripture now sat in wordless purgatory. He looked at Rebecca differently, not with hate, not even with anger, but with loss, as if she were a ghost in his home wearing his wife's skin. He prayed, but the prayers never left his throat. He wanted to ask why. He wanted to scream, "How could you?" But more than anything, Elijah wanted it to be untrue. And yet, deep inside him, buried beneath the soldier, the pastor, the foster father, was a man unraveling. Not because of what Rebecca had once been, but because he could no longer see the woman she had always been. And that, to Elijah Franklin, was the beginning of a grief unlike any he had ever known. It wasn't until the fifth night that Elijah finally spoke. Rebecca had just finished washing the dinner dishes, humming an old Sam Cooke tune as she wiped her hands on a towel. The air in the house had grown thick with silence all week, something heavy, unspoken, pressing down on every corner. She'd felt it in the way Elijah didn't touch her shoulder when he passed, and how he didn't say grace before meals anymore. And that night, as she turned from the sink, she found him standing in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes red-rimmed. "Who are you?" The words were low, hoarse, not angry but hollow, like they'd been squeezed out of a man who hadn't slept in days. Rebecca's fingers froze mid-motion. She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't pretend not to know. Slowly, she pulled out a chair and sat down. "I'm the same woman who's loved you for 30 years, she said softly. "The same one who brought you soup when you had the flu, who held your hand when you buried your brother, who stayed up every Christmas Eve, making sure the tree looked perfect for the kids." Elijah didn't move, didn't blink. "You lied to me," he said. Rebecca nodded, eyes misty. "I didn't lie to hurt you. I lied to survive." There was silence again, the kind that makes clocks louder, makes every breath a burden. "You're a man," Elijah whispered, as if saying it aloud made it more unbearable. "No," Rebecca said firmly, for the first time showing fire. "I was born male, but I'm not a man. I haven't been for a long, long time. Everything I gave you, my love, my faith, my life, that was real. This," she touched her chest gently, "this is who I've always been." Elijah turned his face away. "You let me build a life with a lie," he said. Rebecca rose and walked toward him slowly. She placed her hand on his arm, but he flinched as if touched by flame. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said. I finally became someone I could live with. And when you came into my life, I finally believed God could love me too." Elijah looked at her, really looked. For a moment, his face softened. The tears welled. The grief was thick enough to drown in. But then he pulled away. "You didn't just take away my trust," he said. "You took away my truth, my faith, my calling." He walked out the front door, Bible clutched under one arm, not looking back. Rebecca stood alone in the kitchen, hands trembling, as the old Sam Cooke record played on. "It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gone come." She didn't know yet that the change would come in blood. For the next 2 weeks, Elijah Franklin became a ghost inside his own life. He stopped preaching. No more Thursday night men's groups. No Sunday sermons. Just silence. He claimed it was rest. Claimed he was praying. But those close to him saw the shift, the tiredness in his eyes, the weight in his shoulders, the way he'd stare blankly at the cross above the altar like it had turned its back on him. Deacon John tried checking in. "Pastor, you need to talk to somebody. Ain't no shame in being human." "I'm not human," Elijah muttered. "I'm a shepherd, and I led my whole flock through a valley of lies." At night, he'd sit alone in his church office with the lights off, only the soft hum of the ceiling fan spinning overhead. His Bible sat untouched on the desk. He'd stare at the framed photo of him and Rebecca taken during their 25th anniversary. Her in a pale blue dress, him in his Sunday best, both smiling like their hearts had never known doubt. Now, Elijah couldn't even look her in the eye. Rebecca, for her part, gave him space. She still lit the candles, still made his coffee, even if it sat untouched. Every night she whispered a quiet prayer before bed, asking for mercy, not from Elijah, but from the God she still believed in. "Let him see me, Lord," she whispered. "Not who I was, but who I am." But Elijah didn't want prayers. He wanted answers, or maybe punishment, and so he turned inward, dug through old scriptures, found verses that once brought comfort, now twisted into torment. He questioned everything, his ministry, his manhood, even his salvation. How could God let him stand at the pulpit, year after year, preaching righteousness, while being deceived under his own roof? He thought about leaving, about disappearing, letting it all collapse. But then a darker thought took root. Maybe, he whispered one night into the dark, God didn't bring her into my life to bless me. Maybe he brought her to test me. And Elijah Franklin had never failed a test in his life. On the third Sunday of March, without telling a soul, he ironed his best black suit. He polished his shoes, combed his silver beard, and slipped his father's pistol into the hollowed-out binding of his oldest leather Bible, the one he'd used on the day of their wedding. As he stepped out the front door, Rebecca stood in the hallway, eyes wide. "Are you preaching today?" she asked gently. He turned, stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "I have something to say." And with that, Pastor Elijah Franklin walked out the door, toward the pulpit that had always saved him, with murder on his mind. The sanctuary was packed. Spring sunlight poured through stained glass windows, scattering reds and golds across the polished oak pews. The choir had just finished their second number, a soaring rendition of His Eye is on the Sparrow. The congregation clapped, swaying with joy, not knowing the storm that was about to break overhead. Deacon John stood at the pulpit, checking his watch for the third time. "Still no Elijah." "Y'all give us just a moment," he said with a polite smile. "Pastor's coming." Just then, the double doors creaked open. Elijah Franklin stepped inside. He looked regal, sharp black suit, polished shoes, Bible tucked neatly under his arm. But there was a stiffness to his walk, a frozen solemnity in his eyes that chilled even the most joyful hearts in the front rows. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't shake hands or flash that warm smile folks had grown up with. He simply walked the aisle like a man headed to his own funeral. Rebecca sat in the third pew, dressed in a simple white dress. She watched him ascend the pulpit with a mixture of pride and dread. Something in her chest tightened. He knows. Elijah stood at the pulpit for a long while, his Bible resting closed in front of him. The crowd grew quiet. An unease crept into the air like smoke. Then he began. "For 30 years, Elijah said, his voice low, measured, I've preached to you about truth, about sin and salvation, about building your house on the rock of righteousness." He looked up, his gaze sweeping the room like a final benediction. But what happens when a rock turns out to be sand? Murmurs fluttered through the crowd. Rebecca sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap. "I have been deceived," Elijah continued. "For decades, in my own home, in my own marriage, I believed I was walking in the light. But it turns out, even a man of God can be blind." He opened the Bible slowly. Inside, snug between Psalms and Proverbs, was the cold steel of a pistol. Gasps erupted. One woman in the back fainted. Ushers moved forward, unsure if it was a demonstration or something worse. But Elijah was already speaking again. "The woman I married, the woman I have loved and honored for 3 decades, is not who she claimed to be." He pointed down toward the pew. "Rebecca Grace Franklin, come forward." A hush fell so heavy you could hear the ceiling fan spin. Rebecca stood, calmly. No tears, no trembling. She walked to the front of the church with the same grace she'd used to carry communion trays and cradle orphan babies. When she reached him, she looked him straight in the eyes. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. Elijah blinked. For a moment, he hesitated. "I gave you my life," he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. "And you gave me shame. I gave you love," she answered. "And I gave you everything I had." A single tear slid down his cheek. His hand trembled. And then he pulled the trigger. Crack! The first shot hit her shoulder. Rebecca gasped but didn't fall. Her eyes never left his. Crack! The second bullet caught her in the chest. Her knees buckled. She dropped to the floor in a white heap, blood soaking the hem of her dress. Screams erupted. Congregants ran. Mothers grabbed children. Deacon John tackled Elijah to the ground as the third shot fired wild, shattering the stained glass window of the resurrection behind the pulpit. The gun clattered to the floor. Blood spread like wine at the altar. Rebecca Franklin lay motionless beneath the wooden cross. Elijah didn't struggle. He didn't speak. As police stormed the sanctuary, guns drawn, he raised his hands and whispered, "It is done." He was cuffed in front of the very pews where he had baptized babies and buried saints. And as they led him away through the front doors of Second Grace Baptist, the church that once bore witness to salvation had now borne witness to murder. Outside, the bells still rang, but the gospel had gone silent. Montgomery had never seen a trial like this. The beloved shepherd of Second Grace Baptist Church, once the voice of Sunday salvation, was now the man in shackles, escorted into court with a Bible still clutched in his hands. Reporters packed the courtroom. Satellite trucks lined the street like vultures waiting for meat. The nation wanted to understand how a preacher could become a killer and how a marriage that looked like grace ended in bullets. The prosecution didn't waste time. They called it what it was, a hate crime. This wasn't a crime of passion, District Attorney Vanessa Moore told the jury. This was a calculated execution, born not out of confusion, but out of contempt. Pastor Franklin knew who Rebecca was. He knew she wasn't a threat to him, but he decided her identity was a sin punishable by death. The courtroom was still, except for the scribbling of pens and the quiet weeping from the foster children who had once called the Franklins mom and dad. The defense had a different story. Led attorney Marshall King, a retired Marine himself, painted Elijah as a man betrayed, not by God, but by the one person he trusted most. Imagine giving 30 years of your life to someone, he said, pacing before the jury, building your entire identity around them, sharing your faith, your family, your future, only to learn one day it was all a lie. Mr. Franklin is not a monster, King added. He is a man whose soul broke under the weight of deception. Was he wrong? Yes. But should we treat his breakdown as premeditated murder? No. Elijah remained mostly silent during the proceedings. He looked smaller now in his orange jumpsuit. No longer the towering figure behind the pulpit, but a man wrecked, gray, hollow-eyed, heavy with something even prison couldn't weigh down. But when he took the stand, the room held its breath. I did not kill Rebecca because she was born a man, Elijah said. I killed her because I couldn't carry the shame anymore. Because every time I stood in that church, I felt like a fraud. Because when I looked in her eyes, all I saw was the face of a truth I wasn't strong enough to accept. I failed her. I failed God. And I failed all of you. The room was silent when he stepped down. Even the reporters stopped typing. 3 hours later, the jury returned. Guilty of second-degree murder. Sentenced to 40 years without the possibility of parole. There was no applause. No satisfaction. Just a long exhale. Justice had been served, but it tasted bitter. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs that read, "Trans Lives Matter," and "Love is not deception." Others quoted scripture and called Elijah a martyr for traditional values. But most people, especially those who knew the Franklins, just stood in stunned silence, unsure what to believe anymore. Because at the heart of it, this wasn't just a courtroom tragedy. It was a deeply personal reckoning, a collision between love and doctrine, between identity and pride, and no verdict could ever make it right. Not for Elijah, not for Rebecca, and not for a town still trying to understand how something that looked like heaven could fall so far. They buried Rebecca Grace Franklin under the same oak tree where she once read bedtime stories to foster kids. It wasn't a church funeral. Second Grace Baptist declined to host it, said it would send the wrong message. So instead, the service was held in a quiet, windswept cemetery on the east side of Montgomery, the kind of place where names fade off headstones and birds always seem to sing just a little softer. A modest group gathered. No reporters. No pastors, just a few of the children she helped raise, now adults with kids of their own. A few old women from her Bible study. A nurse from the free clinic where she once volunteered. And Jasmine. Jasmine was the first foster child Rebecca ever took in. She was 6 years old then, with braids too tight and a voice so small you had to bend down to hear her. Now 27, She was a social worker in Birmingham. She stepped forward at the gravesite, hands trembling, to deliver a eulogy no one else dared to give. "I didn't know Rebecca used to be someone else," she began, voice thick with emotion. "But I know who she was to me. She was the first person who ever told me I was more than my past. She was the first to brush my hair without hurting me, the first to sit by my bed and sing until I fell asleep, and the only one who showed up at my high school graduation when nobody else did." Jasmine paused, looked out over the small crowd. She may not have been born a mother, but she became mine. Silence followed, then sniffles. A breeze stirred the magnolia trees, and beneath the ground, Rebecca was laid to rest with a tombstone that read, "Rebecca Grace Franklin, 1961 to 2023, created in his image, and he saw that it was good." Genesis 1 verse 27. Elijah Franklin now wakes up each morning to the clanking of cell doors and the cold buzz of fluorescent lights. He spends most of his time in a small prison chapel, not preaching, but listening, reading, sitting alone with the ghost of his choices. He has a cellmate named Bernard, a former gang member turned prison poet, who once told a guard, "That preacher ain't crazy. He's just cracked in all the places nobody can reach." Elijah doesn't argue. He no longer speaks much. In a letter to Deacon John, written 6 months after his conviction, Elijah wrote, "I thought I was saving her soul, but she had already saved mine, and I destroyed the only person who ever truly saw me." He closed the letter with Psalm 51. "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." John never wrote back. Meanwhile, Second Grace Baptist has a new pastor, young, progressive, and determined to rebuild the congregation's broken spirit. The pews are still half empty, but change is slow in the South. One Sunday, Jasmine returned to visit. She sat in the back pew, holding her daughter's hand. During the benediction, the pastor spoke of grace, not as perfection, but as presence, of love that stretches wider than we expect. After the service, Jasmine left behind a sealed envelope at the foot of the pulpit. Inside was a photo of Rebecca holding Jasmine as a child, both laughing on the porch of the old Franklin home. On the back, Jasmine had written, "If God is love, then she was never a lie." In Montgomery, folks still talk about the Franklins. In beauty salons and bait shops, over sweet tea and church potlucks. Some still call Elijah a victim of betrayal. Others see him as a murderer blinded by pride and doctrine. But most just don't know what to say, because this wasn't the kind of story that ends cleanly. There's no bow to tie, no verse to explain away the pain. Just a truth that's hard, a love that was real, a man who broke, and a woman who lived her truth until her last breath. What remains now are echoes of sermons once spoken, prayers once whispered, lives once intertwined, and of one woman's name carved into stone, not because she hid who she was, but because she finally dared to live it. Rebecca Grace Franklin. Not a deception, not a sin, not a secret, just a soul finally known. Year 3 of Elijah Franklin's sentence arrived with no fanfare, no visitors, no cards, just another gray Alabama morning bleeding in through the narrow window of cell block D. He no longer kept count of the days. It served no purpose. Time, in here, felt like a punishment all its own, slow, heavy, and unrelenting. He spent his mornings cleaning the chapel floors, afternoons shelving donated books, evenings writing letters he never sent. At first, they were addressed to God. Angry, rambling, desperate. "Where were you?" he wrote one night. "Why would you let me stand in your house and love a lie?" But somewhere between rage and regret, the questions changed. He stopped demanding answers, started searching for something else. Humility, maybe, or clarity, or the smallest sliver of peace. Then one evening, under the flickering light of his bunk lamp, Elijah wrote to Rebecca. "Dear Rebecca, you used to say forgiveness wasn't a feeling, it was a choice. I didn't understand that before. I do now. I still don't know how to forgive myself. Not for killing you. That pain is a constant fire in my chest. But for not seeing you for who you truly were. I loved you, and I let fear win." He folded the letter, Never mailed it. Just tucked it into the back of his Bible, behind a page torn from the book of James. Mercy triumphs over judgment. One Sunday afternoon, Bernard, his cellmate, found Elijah staring at the same folded photo that had survived the arrest. Rebecca, laughing beside a Christmas tree, holding a mug of hot cocoa. A candid moment. No makeup, no pretense, just joy. You ever think about what would have happened if you'd done nothing? Bernard asked. All the time, Elijah whispered. Would she have left you? No, that's the worst part. She would have stayed. Bernard shook his head. You loved her. I love the idea of her, Elijah said slowly. I just never made room for who she was. That night, Elijah did something he hadn't done since before the shooting. He prayed, not out loud, not with grand words, just quietly, under his breath, lying flat on the cement bed. Forgive me, not for the gun, not for the lie, but for forgetting that love isn't a transaction. It's a recognition. Outside the prison, the world moved on. A documentary aired on public television titled Rebecca's Truth. It traced her life from small-town Georgia to Montgomery. It featured interviews with former foster children, trans advocates, and even a grainy childhood photo of Reginald Parks smiling in a faded school uniform. The final scene showed her gravestone beneath that old oak tree. Soft piano music played. A voiceover read Jasmine's eulogy. She was more than a headline, more than a label. She was love in its truest form. The documentary received an Emmy nomination. Elijah never saw it, but he heard about it through a letter smuggled in by one of the prison volunteers. Inside the envelope was a single sentence. She mattered, even after. He read it again and again until the ink smudged from tears. Years later, when Bernard was transferred to a lower security facility, he left Elijah with a parting gift. A wooden cross he'd carved from prison scraps. You don't get to rewrite your story, Bernard said, but you can redeem what's left. Elijah kept the cross on his desk in the chapel. Some days, he still hears her laugh, still sees her in dreams, her soft eyes, the warmth in her voice. I was never your punishment, she tells him. I was your mirror. And every time, he wakes up crying, not because it haunts him, but because for just a moment, she's alive again. And in that moment, he remembers, she was never the lie. He was the one who refused to see the truth. It was a Wednesday afternoon in early spring when Elijah Franklin finally stepped up to the pulpit again. Not in a grand sanctuary with stained glass and polished pews, but in a cramped prison chapel that smelled of pine-scented floor cleaner and rusted pipework. There were only 8 men in the room, most of them there to shave time off their sentences. A few, though, like him, were searching for something else. He looked older now, slower. The silver in his beard had gone white. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the Bible. But when he spoke, the room quieted. I used to think God gave me a platform because I had the answers, Elijah began. Now I believe he gave it to me, so I could learn to ask better questions. No one blinked. Not even the lifer in the back row, who usually slept through sermons. I love the woman, he said, voice catching. A good woman. A woman who saved me when I didn't even know I was lost. And I took her life because I thought my shame mattered more than her truth. He paused, swallowed hard. But shame is not from God. Shame is a weight we wear when we fear the light. One of the younger inmates, tattoos still fresh on his neck, leaned forward in his seat. Elijah noticed. Some of you think you're beyond redemption, he continued. I used to believe that too. I thought the cross I carried was mine alone. But I've come to understand grace doesn't vanish in the dark. It waits there, quietly, until we're ready to open our eyes. When he finished, the room stayed quiet for a long time. Not a cough, not a whisper. Then one man stood, then another. And by the end of the hour, 7 inmates had gathered around Elijah's wooden podium, not to pray with him, but to grieve with him. In that moment, he wasn't the killer. He wasn't the preacher. He was simply a man, broken but still breathing. That night, in his cell, Elijah took out one final letter. This one wasn't addressed to God or Rebecca. It was addressed to Jasmine. He thanked her for speaking at the funeral, for the photo, for remembering the woman that others tried to erase. You were the daughter Rebecca never had by blood, but always had by heart, he wrote. And I hope you know, despite the pain I caused, your love for her kept her alive longer than I ever did. He sealed the envelope and asked the prison chaplain to send it. Outside those walls, Jasmine received the letter weeks later. She read it sitting on her apartment balcony in Birmingham, the city lights glowing behind her. When she finished, she didn't cry. She didn't curse his name. She simply whispered, "Took you long enough." And then she folded the letter, placed it next to the photo of her and Rebecca that sat on her bookshelf, and turned off the light. In the darkness, love still echoed. Not perfectly, not neatly, but honestly. And sometimes that's the only kind of grace we get. Elijah Franklin died on a quiet Tuesday morning, 13 years into his sentence. There was no dramatic collapse, no final sermon, no last-minute revelation scrawled into the margins of his Bible. Just a slow fading. His heart gave out during morning count. His body found slumped beside the chapel pew he'd polished every week like it still mattered. He was 70 years old. The prison warden offered to contact any surviving family. There were none. No siblings left. No next of kin listed. Just one emergency contact written in shaky cursive on the intake form from years ago. Jasmine L. Monroe. She was notified by phone. There was a long silence on her end when they told her. Then, "Did he die alone?" "Yes, ma'am," the officer replied quietly. "But he died peaceful." 3 weeks later, Elijah was buried in a small, unmarked grave behind the prison chapel. Jasmine attended the burial, alone. No media, no clergy, just her and the wind. She brought no flowers, just one thing, a folded photo of Rebecca, the same one Elijah kept all those years. She placed it on the dirt mound and whispered, "You were his mirror," even when he didn't want to look. Then she turned and walked away, heels crunching against gravel, the weight of 2 lives tucked somewhere behind her ribs. Years later, when Jasmine spoke at a youth conference about forgiveness, a young man asked her if she ever hated Elijah for what he did. She paused, smiled faintly. "I hated what he did," she said, "but I couldn't hate the man who spent his last years trying to understand why." She looked out at the audience, rows of teenagers searching for meaning in a world full of shadows. Grace doesn't erase what happened. It just refuses to let it be the final word. In the end, Elijah Franklin wasn't remembered by the pulpit he stood on or the gun he raised, but by the silence he learned to sit in and the truth he finally saw through the eyes of the woman he never truly deserved. Rebecca Grace Franklin. She was never his punishment. She was his last, most painful path to redemption.